Welcome to Playing Above the Line's very first mini-series. I'm Alan, your host, and this episode is one of 10 we're recording with T.R. Miller's legendary football coach, Jamie Riggs. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group, a business consulting and accounting firm focused on preparing clients for the future through innovation and positive growth.
Okay, it's Miller Neal. For a long time, I really couldn't. There's not a better name than the Battle of Murder Creek, but I grew up with just Miller Neal. And so sometimes it's hard for me to say the Battle of Murder Creek, but that's okay. It was fine, but I grew up in Brewton. Mm-hmm. I understand the Miller Neal thing, and I was part of it as a player. And before that, really as a fan. And I was an assistant coach and a head coach, and I had two sons that played in it. I pretty much understand the thing as good as anyone can. I know a lot of people over there, and we're just fortunate that we have this great rivalry.
Yeah, it is Miller Neal week, and I know you're going to try to capture some of the craziness and funny moments that is this week, but I don't know that really people can truly understand it until they've actually lived it. This is not only one of the greatest rivalries in high school football, but I would dare say it's one of the greatest rivalries in sports in this part of the state anyway.
Yeah, it is, and back in the mid-'90s when we had some great football teams, and Neal did too. They had some great football teams. And we're playing down there in 90, 95, 96, 97. I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at one point in time, 4 times we had played them in a row. They had been undefeated 3 of the 4 times we had played them. And so they were great. Yeah. And the community was just nuts. I don't know any other way to explain that. And in 1995, we had a great football team. They were tremendous, and they're just rolling over everybody, and everybody can see this coming. It's coming, and the game is just a great game. And then they're in the same classification with us, so we win the game, close game, and we both start going in the playoffs, playing in the playoffs. We're winning, they're winning. It's coming again. I mean, it's coming again in the semifinals. Everybody knows it. It's coming again. It was just nuts. And one of the things I really remember about those days is one year we played over at Neal. We were both undefeated. We played over at Neal. And so, we stayed here. We dressed at our place and everything, just ride the bus over and get out. We get on the buses, and we start going down. And there is nobody in Brewton. There's no cars on the street. There's nobody there. And this is like 5:45 or something. There's just nobody anywhere. Everybody's at the game. And it was just really eerie, and actually when it's just kind of neat. So we've been real fortunate to have a rival like this. But there's been a lot of things that have happened, obviously. We started playing them in, I believe, 1946. I believe it was. We started playing them. There's been a lot of great things and a lot of great people involved in this. And anyway, this one is entitled Miller Neal Stuff. The rivalry between T.R. Miller and W.S. Neal is a classic high school athletic rivalry. We played each other in all sports, but football has always seemed to be the focal point. As in most rivalries, emotions run deep in this one. Miller is located in Brewton as a city school, and Neal is in East Brewton as a county school. The cities are separated only by a creek, properly named Murder Creek. The colors are important. Miller is red, white, and black, while the Eagles are blue and gold. On football Fridays, everyone would wear the colors of their school. The game is promoted as the Battle of Murder Creek. This rivalry has history, funny moments, and great games. The graduates have intermarried, so many of the great players at Neal married girls from Miller, and often the children played at Miller. The people in the two communities shop at the same stores, worked together, and often even went to church together. We've been mostly civil to each other down through the years. Back in the 1960s, Neal was mostly dominant in the football competition, winning 8 of the 10 games. When the Eagles would get a lead, they would turn somersaults. Now, we called them Neal monkey rolls, but they would turn somersaults on the field after scoring as they went back down the field for the kickoff. Fights were pretty common in those days. One year, they had a pretty good fight that involved several players from both schools at a cemetery. It seemed kind of appropriate. Every so often, Neal might find a dead chicken tied to their goalpost. And yes, You always had to check early Friday morning to see if a dead cat was going to be hanging from the goalpost at our place. In 1972, Larry Rampey was our coach. He declared that we had all these people hurt who would not play in the game. He actually bandaged them up and took their picture for the Brewton Standard. That same year, James Hicks, Neal's meanest player, and pretty much feared by everyone at our school. He had torn his knee up at mid-season, but declared to everyone that he wasn't going to have surgery until after the Miller-Neal game. His intention was to play. He played the entire first half until the pain medication wore off. In 1973, I was a senior at Miller, and we had lost 3 in a row to Neal. For some reason, we all went to the store and bought blue towels and wore them on our pants, and we beat Neal 35-6. Now, in the days before the Alabama High School Athletic Association wanted the visiting team to wear white, Neal would often wear powder blue uniforms when they played in Brewton. In 1988, when Joel Williams was the head coach at Miller, the Tigers pulled out the black jerseys for the first time against Neal in a 13-7 win. In the 70s and the 80s, it was a tradition to try and egg the other school the night before the game, and it was quite a challenge to do so and not get caught. The Miller coaches would come to the school after dark and stand guard. Our superintendent, Dale Garner, would cook fish and bring it to the coaches to eat. Well into the 2000s, I would go up and turn on the lights and sit in the press box. By those days, no one really did any damage, but I just went for the tradition of the whole thing. I felt like I was honoring the coaches of the past. Everybody got a little nervous when it came to the Neal game. In 1984, Mike Sasser was our coach, and I was the defensive coordinator. Mike was really nervous because it was Neal, and before the Thursday afternoon practice, he had already gone out on the football field. Thursday practices were just in shorts and didn't last long. Roger Jones was our starting linebacker and was messing with someone as usual on the way to practice. They were behind the stadium. We had these metal gates that went over the doors back there to keep people out. The other kid got tired of Roger and started to chase him. Roger took off to run, and when he did, he ran right into one of those metal gates, and it split his forehead open. Blood went everywhere. He came out on the field where Coach Sasser was standing. His head coach told him this: go to the emergency room and get sewed up. But if you do not play tomorrow night against Neal, it will be the last time you ever wear a Miller uniform. You will be through. One thing we all knew: Mike Sasser was a man of his word, and Roger knew that. About the time we got finished with practice that day, Roger walked up. He had more than a dozen stitches in his forehead, and it was all swollen up. Roger looked at Coach Sasser and pronounced, "The doctor said I could play." Donnie Roch and I started laughing. "You're lying. That doctor hadn't said that," we said at the same time. "You dummy. Your head will be swollen up so much you won't even be able to get your helmet on tomorrow night," I said. So the next night, I helped Roger pry his helmet on his head. He played every defensive snap against Neal, and we won 27-0. "Is your head hurting?" I asked him during the game. No, sir, it's okay," he replied. "You're lying again," I said. In 1989, my first year as head coach, we had a couple players who skipped school the morning of the game and went riding around with their girlfriends. Coach Cotton was our principal. He called me over to let me know what was going on and said, "I got the police looking for them. Everything will be okay if we can get them back to school in a few minutes." After they found them and got them back to school, I told Coach Cotton to go ahead and suspend them. "Really?" he said. "Yeah," I told him. "If we can't beat Neal without these two guys, we deserve to lose." So he suspended them. That night he went to the game, and when he went up in the bleachers, the fans got all over him about suspending players on the day of the Miller-Neal game. "I'll never do that again," he said. The rivalry got especially heated in the 1990s. Both schools had great teams, and competition got fierce. In 1990, Neal turned us in for having an ineligible player the Monday after we beat them 48-14. Our backup kicker entered the game to kick the last extra point, and Neal said he was ineligible. He had moved from Atmore to Brewton and had rented a house on Belleville Avenue. I verified he and his father were living there. But sometime during the season, his father went back to living in Atmore, where he preached at a church there. So the young man went to live with his mother, who was divorced from her father. The only problem was she lived in East Brewton. The young man's brother-in-law was a Neal supporter, and he told the Neal coaches about it. I had no idea that he had changed residence. It was news across the state that we might have to forfeit games and not make the playoffs even though we were undefeated. Neal had known about it for several weeks, but waited until we played them to turn us in. The Alabama High School Athletic Association came down and talked to everyone in an investigation. I've never told anyone this, but Frank Cotton's relationship with the Alabama High School Athletic Association saved us. They made some ruling that Neal had to turn us in before the end of the regular season and told us not to play him anymore. They had us dead to rights, but Frank talked them out of it. He never lost to Neal as a coach, and he never lost to them as a principal either. Neal had the greatest stadium to play in, and it was packed in the 1990s. It was small, tight, and extremely loud. If it rained, it got really muggy on the field. The sidelines were so tight as well, and the fans would be talking to the players during the game. One year they put skunk scent in our locker room. You couldn't even go in there. I marched right in their field house and demanded another place, and they put us in the old gym. Another time they locked the gate we normally drove our bus through, making us wait 10 minutes before they got a key. So after that, we took bolt cutters with us every time we went over there to play. In 1999, we beat them 49-0, and they locked the gate to get to our bus. We pulled out the bolt cutters, and the players cheered as we destroyed the lock and went through the gate. In 1996, they beat us in the regular season, but we came back to beat them in the semifinals of the state playoffs. Before that game, they had put a big sign up declaring themselves as area champions, which they had become by beating us. Sometime after the game, Carl McInnes stuck back into the stadium and took the sign off the press box. A few years later, he brought it to me to store for safekeeping. It was still at our field house when I retired. In 1997, the Eagles had a great team when we met them in the last game. They were undefeated and were ranked number 3 in the state. We upset them. They had planned to shoot fireworks after the games when they beat us. One of our players' parents left something at the field and went back to get it about an hour after the game. He said it sounded like the 4th of July as they were setting off with fireworks that had been preloaded before the game. One strange thing that the Eagles did in those days was to warm up at their place when the game was played in Brewton. They would make a grand entrance, and their fans would go crazy about 20 minutes before the game. I would just tell our players they're probably not going to be here for warm-ups. We would ignore the whole thing. During a mid-90s game, when we were both undefeated, we had an incident at trade school the week of the game. Now, both schools go to the same trade school, and both teams had several guys that took classes there. Apparently, players from both teams took this old boy and hit him over the head with some kind of stick and locked him up in a closet as a joke. The trade school started investigating and realized that players from both teams were involved. It was a couple of days before the big game. In a bit of brilliant decision-making, the investigation continued for 3 more days, and it was the next Monday when the suspensions were handed out to everyone. Everybody bet on the games in those days. The fans and the parents all worked together, and they just couldn't stand it. People were always asking our coaches about what they thought about the game. They would say, hey, the line is 6 points. We are going to beat them by more than 6 points, aren't we? Neal was so confident when they had a good team that they would give points. I remember Coach Hart one year, when we were both undefeated, saying that he was telling everybody, if they are crazy enough to give you points, take all you can get. I think we made our fans some really nice money in those days. One year after we beat them and the playoffs had started, I was walking out to my truck. I was the last to leave, and there was a young man waving me in the parking lot. It was Neal's quarterback, and he was their best player. He said he wanted to come to Miller and asked me what it would take for him to move and be eligible. I told him. We talked for a couple of minutes before he left, but I never heard from him again. In 2008, Neal announced that they wanted to move the game from the end of the season to the middle of the season. What? Their reasoning was that the game was too emotional and it hurt them in the playoffs. They were pretty determined to move it. And I'm pretty much a traditionalist, and I was totally against it. I said that it had never bothered me or my team in the playoffs, but surprisingly, they were not interested in my opinion. I even called Terry Clark, the mayor of East Brewton, and he said he was staying out of it. An article appeared in the Brewton Standard, and it was big news around both communities. I knew that there would be some Neal people who would not want the big game moved. I also knew that Neal struggled some financially with athletics, as most of us did, and they were not going to turn down this big cash cow that was the Battle of Murder Creek. So I announced that we would play at the end of the season or we wouldn't play at all. After a few days, Neal relented, and the game stayed at the end of the season. For months afterward, I would see Neal supporters around town who thanked me for keeping the game where it had traditionally been played. A decade or so ago, we beat Neal one night at our place, and they left their battle flag at the stadium. Bad move. I guess we should have given it back to them, but Coach Mark Edge retrieved it and kept it in his office. There was a push a few years ago by people in the two communities to end some of the bad feelings between the two schools. I didn't know we had bad feelings. I stayed out of it. We have this great rivalry, and sometimes we get a little upset with each other. But at the end of the day, we're lucky to have great competition. We're lucky to have each other. I treasure the rivalry. Neal players always played their hearts out to beat Miller, and I always had great respect for all of them. I have seen the hurt in their eyes for years after a Miller loss and understand it completely. I used to tell our players that they had no idea how hard Neal was going to play on Friday night. But I also told them that Neal does not understand the lengths we will go to gain this victory. I will leave with this one. In 1951, Neal's school burned. They were obviously going to have to build some new buildings. The president of the Brewton City Board of Education made a motion at the school board meeting that the board hire a group from the state Department of Education to study the possibility of combining W.S. Neal and T.R. Miller into one school. He also recommended as part of the motion that the two schools, communities, and school boards agree to follow the recommendation of the State Department of Education. He never got a second to his motion.
Well, I did not know that part, but I cannot imagine not having this rivalry. It's just been something that's been such a big part of this community for years, and the fact that that was even a thought in somebody's mind, that blows my mind.
And the thought behind it at the time was that Miller did a good job of preparing. Now, this is 1951.
Right.
You don't have the number of people trying to go to college that you had at that time.
Yeah.
Miller at the time did a better job of preparing people that wanted to go to college. But Neal at the time had FFA and a lot of other things, and there were, at that time, a little more still agricultural society a little bit, that they did a good job in those things and helped prepare them for work a little more. That if you combine the two schools, you could have the best of both worlds. And that seemed to be the thought behind the motion that they did, because they knew at the time that Neal would have to build a new school. Now, I think part of the issue was, where was the school going to be?
Oh, yeah, that would have been
And
huge.
so seeing that Neal was going to build a new school, it looked like that probably the high school might be in East Brewton. I don't think that was going to fly.
No, definitely not. I can't imagine. Two things that kind of stood out. Girlfriends made the guest appearance in this in this episode, so folks can go back and listen to that whole episode that we did on girlfriends. But again, that bless them, they almost threw a monkey wrench in that game.
Yeah, and I used to tell our players the week of the Miller-Neal game, hey, you better off not taking your play sheet home. Don't take it home. If you can study it here, do whatever, and hang on to it, and don't leave it laying in a classroom somewhere, because we've got girls here who take guys at Neal and stuff like that. So the espionage part of this, we were concerned about too, about them getting that. And, I used to be really careful about people watching us practice. Mm-hmm. I tried not to be paranoid about it, and I really went nuts when they built the YMCA. When they built the YMCA, you could stand on the upstairs portion over there, and if we're on the football field, you could see right into our football field. And so for several years, I took a manager the week of the Miller-Neal game and put him in the YMCA up there on the track, standing by the window. And he was told that if anybody stopped and started looking out the window to tell them that Coach Riggs said they needed to leave.
That's great. I mean, espionage was a real thing in this game, and folks think we're joking, but we're not. One more thing I want to point out, you mentioned a guy named James Hicks, and just to kind of tell you, yes, it's a fierce rivalry. People have emotions that run deep and whatnot, but at the end of the day, we are really deep down, whether we want to admit it or not, one community, and we really do care about one another. So James Hicks, who you pegged to be the meanest person on that Neal team that you guys played back in the 70s, kind of came full circle and helped you out a few times. Talk about how James kind of came back and helped the old T.R. Miller coach out.
James ended up working for the Brewton City Police Department for many, many years, was a great policeman for years. He would travel to a lot of the games with us and everything, and so, like, I'm going on and off the field, and he's the guy that's protecting me. I'll just be pretty honest. I felt pretty good when James Hicks was with me, because I said I knew him from high school. And I'm not going to say everybody at T.R. Miller feared James Hicks, but I didn't know anybody that didn't. So I felt pretty good about that, but I just enjoyed, getting to do that and everything. He was a terrific football player, linebacker. And that's true about him tearing his knee up and all. But he said he's playing against Miller, and we're like, okay, he can't last long, can he?
Great rivalry, and win or lose tomorrow night in 2021. This game is one of the greats in high school football, so I can't wait. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. It definitely helps us in the ratings, and it also makes it easier for other folks to find the podcast. And as always, a big thank you to producer and editor Carrie Wolf. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, you can visit our website at avisogroup.com. That's AVIZO group.com. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks for listening.